The morning sun cast long shadows across Kandahar airfield as Captain Zara, Viper, Cowrie methodically guided another AGM-114 Hellfire missile into the weapons bay of her Thunderbolt II. The desert heat was already building, but her movements remained precise, deliberate. Each rocket represented months of training, years of preparation, and decades of proving herself in a world that still questioned whether women belonged in combat aircraft. Colonel Marcus Webb observed from across the flight line, his weathered face etched with the skepticism of 30 years in the Air Force. Another female pilot, he thought, probably fresh from flight school, playing dress-up in a warbird that demanded respect earned through blood and thunder. The A-10 wasn't some sleek fighter jet for aerial acrobatics. It was a flying tank, designed to get down and dirty with ground support missions that separated the warriors from the wannabes. But something caught his eye as Viper turned to inspect the aircraft's GAU-8 cannon. There on her flight suit's right chest pocket, nestled beneath her pilot wings, was a small black badge he hadn't seen in 15 years. His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. The Combat Action Badge. That wasn't unusual for pilots these days. But below it, almost hidden in the morning shadow, was something that made his blood run cold with recognition. The Prisoner of War Medal. Webb's mind raced. Female combat pilots had only been officially authorized for close air support missions like the A-10 in recent years. Yet this badge suggested combat experience that predated current policy by decades. His eyes narrowed as he studied her profile. Mid-30s, maybe younger, with the kind of composed confidence that came from surviving situations that killed others. But when had she earned that medal? Where had she served? And more importantly, why wasn't her service record reflecting what that badge represented? As Viper completed her pre-flight inspection, she moved with an efficiency that spoke of muscle memory forged in crisis. Her hands didn't shake as she checked connections. Her eyes didn't dart nervously across the horizon. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had already faced the worst the world could offer and emerged intact. Colonel Webb set down his coffee and began walking toward the flight line. There were questions that needed answers, and something told him that Captain Cowrie's story was far more complex than her personnel file suggested. The secret badge told a story of survival, but the woman wearing it remained an enigma wrapped in Air Force Regulation Blue. The wind picked up across the tarmac, carrying the scent of jet fuel and the promise of another day in a war zone where nothing was ever quite what it seemed. Major Elena "Ghost" Vasquez approached the flight line with the kind of purposeful stride that made junior officers step aside without thinking. As Kandahar's deputy operations officer, she had seen hundreds of pilots come and go, but something about the new A-10 pilot intrigued her. Captain Cowrie had arrived 3 weeks ago with minimal fanfare and maximum mystery. Her service jacket read like a redacted intelligence briefing, full of gaps that raised more questions than answers. "Captain," Ghost called out as Viper secured the last weapons pylon, "ready for today's mission brief." Viper turned, and for just a moment, Elena caught something in her eyes, a flash of wariness that went deeper than normal pre-mission nerves. It was the look of someone who had learned that survival often depended on knowing exactly who you could trust and when. "Yes, ma'am," Viper replied, her voice carrying just a hint of an accent that Elena couldn't quite place. Middle Eastern, perhaps, but softened by years of American military training. Package looks straightforward. Close air support for 3rd Battalion, grid coordinates already programmed. "Straightforward missions have a way of becoming complicated out there," Elena observed, studying the younger pilot's face. "Especially when you're flying solo." "I prefer it that way." The response came too quickly, too automatic. Elena had heard those words before from pilots who had learned not to depend on wingmen who might not be there when the shooting started. But something about Viper's delivery suggested experience that went beyond normal combat rotations. Colonel Webb joined them, his presence immediately shifting the dynamics of the conversation. At 6'3" with silver hair and command presence that could stop conversations across a room, Webb was Old Guard Air Force, the kind of officer who had earned his stars through Vietnam-era combat missions and Cold War standoffs. "Captain Cowery," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and barely concealed curiosity. "I was reviewing your flight records, impressive statistics, but I noticed some gaps in your service history." Viper's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, your personnel file shows standard flight training progression, but your proficiency scores suggest combat experience that doesn't match your official deployment history." Webb's eyes dropped to her chest, where the mysterious badge remained partially hidden. "Care to explain that disconnect?" Alina watched the exchange with growing interest. There was clearly more to this conversation than routine personnel review. Webb had the look of a hunter who had caught scent of prey, while Viper carried herself with the defensive readiness of someone who had learned that the wrong answer to the wrong question could be deadly. "I've had excellent instructors, sir," Viper replied carefully. "I'm sure you have." Webb's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We'll continue this conversation after your mission. Dismissed." As Viper walked toward her aircraft, Alina noticed the subtle changes in her gait, slightly more alert, marginally more cautious. Whatever secrets Captain Cowery was carrying, Colonel Webb had just let her know he was aware they existed. Flight Lieutenant James "Torch" Morrison had been maintaining A-10 Warthogs for 8 years, but he'd never worked with a pilot quite like Captain Cowery. Most aviators treated their aircraft like expensive machinery, respectful but distant. Viper touched her plane like she was greeting an old friend, running her fingers along surfaces that other pilots barely glanced at during pre-flight. "She's got some history, this bird," Torch commented as Viper examined the titanium bathtub that surrounded the cockpit. "Flew combat missions over Iraq in 03, took small arms fire over Afghanistan in 09, still flying strong." "Good," Viper replied, continuing her inspection with methodical thoroughness. "Aircraft with combat experience understand what's expected of them." Torch paused in his checklist. That was an unusual way to phrase it. Most pilots talked about aircraft performance specifications or maintenance schedules. They didn't speak about planes like they were sentient beings with memory and purpose. "You talk like you've worked with combat veterans before," he observed. "Haven't we all?" Viper's response was noncommittal, but Torch caught the way her hand lingered on a patch of fuselage that had been repaired after taking enemy fire. Her fingers traced the outline of the aluminum patch with familiar recognition. "Tower to Viper 1, the radio crackled to life. "Weather update shows deteriorating conditions east of your target area, possible sandstorm developing." Viper keyed her mic without hesitation. "Copy Tower, have dealt with worse weather than sand." Torch looked up from his clipboard. There was something in her tone, not bravado or false confidence, but the calm assurance of someone who had flown through conditions that grounded other aviators. He had heard that tone before from pilots who had earned their wings in places where weather was the least of their concerns. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "if you don't mind me asking, where did you log most of your flight hours before coming here?" For a moment, Viper's inspection stopped entirely. When she looked at him, Torch saw something that made him step back involuntarily. Her eyes held depth that went beyond normal military experience, the kind of thousand-yard stare he associated with soldiers who had seen combat that never made it into official reports. "Various assignments, Sergeant," she replied. "Nothing that would be in the standard databases." Before Torch could respond, she had climbed into the cockpit and begun her startup sequence. Through the canopy, he watched her hands move across controls with fluid precision. No hesitation, no double-checking instruments. She knew exactly where everything was located, as if she had flown this specific aircraft configuration hundreds of times before. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and Torch stepped back as Viper taxied toward the runway. As the A-10 gained speed and lifted off, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. From the ground, at just the right angle, he could make out additional markings on the aircraft's tail, faded but still visible under layers of desert camouflage paint. Markings that didn't match any standard Air Force squadron designations he recognized. Captain Rick Longshot Chen monitored the air traffic control frequency from his perch in Kandahar's control tower as Viper's A-10 disappeared into the morning haze. As senior controller, he had guided thousands of aircraft through the complex airspace over Afghanistan, but something about this particular pilot stood out. Her radio communications were textbook perfect, precise, economical, professional. But underneath the standard phraseology, Chen detected subtle variations that suggested training beyond normal Air Force protocols. Her transmission timing was slightly different. Her pronunciation of certain terms carried inflections that hinted at multilingual background, and her situational awareness seemed unusually acute for someone supposedly new to combat zones. Kandahar Tower, Viper 1 requesting updated intelligence on target area, came her voice through the static. Viper 1, standby, Chen replied, then switched to the intelligence frequency. Intel Tower, requesting current threat assessment for Grid 41 SMD 847-293. Tower Intel, assessment unchanged from morning brief. Light small arms possible, no confirmed anti-aircraft systems in area. Chen keyed back to Viper's frequency. Viper 1, threat level remains low, no change from brief. Copy Tower, came her immediate response. Viper 1 has visual on dust cloud bearing 270, possible vehicle movement. Chen checked his scope. No other aircraft had reported vehicle movement in that sector. Either Viper had exceptional eyesight, or she possessed the kind of threat recognition skills that came from extensive combat experience in similar terrain. Viper 1, can you confirm vehicle type and composition? Tower, I count 3 vehicles, possibly technicals with mounted weapons. They're maintaining tactical spacing and moving toward friendly positions. Chen felt a chill run down his spine. The terminology was wrong for standard Air Force communications. Technicals was military contractor slang, and tactical spacing suggested ground combat experience that didn't align with her supposed background as a newly deployed pilot. Viper 1, redirect to investigate suspected hostile movement. Contact Hammer Base on frequency 347.8 for ground coordination. Copy Tower, switching to Hammer frequency. As Viper's transmission ended, Chen realized he had been holding his breath. Something about her situational awareness and tactical terminology suggested experience that went far beyond what appeared in her official records. He reached for his secure phone to call Colonel Webb, then hesitated. Military intelligence often operated through channels that bypassed standard documentation, and asking the wrong questions about the wrong person could derail a career faster than a bird strike could down an aircraft. Still, Chen made a mental note to pay closer attention to Captain Cowery's radio communications. In his experience, pilots who used contractor terminology and demonstrated uncanny threat recognition usually had stories worth investigating. Above the Afghan landscape, Viper banked her A-10 toward the suspected vehicle movement, her hands steady on the controls as she prepared for what might become her first official combat engagement at Kandahar. But for reasons she couldn't share with air traffic control, it would be far from her first time flying combat missions in hostile territory. Staff Sergeant Louis Wrench Rodriguez had spent 6 months maintaining aircraft at Kandahar, and he prided himself on reading pilots the way mechanics read engine diagnostics. Most aviators fell into predictable categories: fresh academy graduates who over-explained everything, seasoned veterans who barely acknowledged ground crew existence, or combat-stressed pilots who had seen too much and said too little. Captain Cowery didn't fit any of those patterns. She had returned from her morning mission with her A-10's GAU-8 cannon having fired exactly 68 rounds. Rodriguez knew, because he counted the empty shell casings during post-flight maintenance. That level of precision suggested either remarkable marksmanship or extensive experience with the aircraft's weapons systems. Most pilots on their first combat missions either fired too much in excitement or too little from hesitation. "How did she handle?" Rodriguez asked as Viper climbed down from the cockpit. "Like she remembered what we were there for," Viper replied, pulling off her helmet. Sweat had darkened her hair, but her hands remained steady as she began her post-flight checklist. "Any problems with the targeting system?" "None. Everything functioned as advertised." Rodriguez noted the phrasing. As advertised suggested familiarity with the system's capabilities beyond what training manuals provided. He had heard similar language from pilots who had used weapons in situations where performance meant survival rather than target practice. "Ma'am," he ventured carefully, "the cannon performed exactly to specifications. That kind of accuracy on a close support mission. Well, it usually takes pilots several combat sorties to achieve that precision." Viper paused in her equipment check. "I had good intel from ground forces." "Yes, ma'am." Rodriguez didn't push further, but he noticed how she avoided eye contact when discussing mission details. Most pilots, especially those with successful engagements, enjoyed sharing tactical specifics. Viper seemed more interested in completing her paperwork and disappearing. As she walked toward the operations building, Rodriguez began his detailed inspection of the aircraft. The A-10 had taken no damage, which wasn't unusual for missions in relatively secure airspace. But something about the aircraft's condition caught his attention. The control surfaces showed where patterns consistent with extreme maneuvering, the kind of stress that came from evasive action under fire, not routine flight operations. More interesting were subtle modifications to the cockpit that hadn't appeared in the aircraft's maintenance logs. Additional switches had been installed near the pilot's left elbow, wiring that didn't match standard A-10 configurations, and what appeared to be aftermarket communication equipment that wasn't part of normal Air Force inventory. Rodriguez had worked on aircraft that had been temporarily modified for special operations, but those changes were always documented and removed after missions. These modifications appeared to be permanent installations that predated Viper's arrival at Kandahar. He photographed the anomalies with his maintenance tablet, then checked the aircraft's service history. According to official records, the plane had undergone standard depot-level maintenance 6 months ago, but the wear patterns Rodriguez observed suggested intensive flight operations during that same period. Someone had been flying this aircraft in combat conditions while it was supposedly undergoing routine maintenance. And based on the precision of today's mission, Rodriguez suspected that someone had been Captain Cowery. The question was where, when, and under what circumstances that combat experience had occurred. Major Elena "Ghost" Vasquez found Colonel Webb in his office, studying personnel files with the intensity of someone trying to decode enemy communications. The afternoon sun streaming through Venetian blinds created shadows across documents spread across his desk, but Elena could see enough to recognize that all the files related to recently arrived pilots. "Sir," she said, entering after his gesture of acknowledgement, "you wanted to see me about Captain Cowery's mission report." Webb looked up, his expression unreadable. "Have you read it?" "Yes, sir. Textbook close air support mission. Engaged 3 enemy vehicles threatening friendly positions, neutralized targets with minimal ammunition expenditure, returned with no damage or casualties." "And what did you think about the tactical details?" Elena had been wondering the same thing since reviewing Viper's after-action report. "The mission execution was unusually efficient, sir, Most pilots require several combat sorties to achieve that level of precision, especially when engaging mobile targets in complex terrain. Webb nodded slowly. Captain Cowery reported engaging targets at ranges that suggest exceptional situational awareness and weapons proficiency. Her radio communications with ground forces demonstrated familiarity with tactical procedures that aren't part of standard Air Force training. "What are you thinking, sir?" Instead of answering directly, Webb handed her a printout of communication intercepts. Intelligence picked up some interesting chatter after today's engagement. Local insurgent communications mentioned the ghost pilot who shoots like she knows the desert. Alina felt a chill. Enemy forces giving pilots nicknames usually indicated either repeated engagements or tactics so distinctive they created lasting impressions. But Viper had supposedly just arrived at Kandahar. "Sir, are you suggesting Captain Cowery has prior combat experience in this theater?" "I'm suggesting that her personnel file doesn't tell the complete story." Webb pulled out another document, a classified message from Air Force Personnel Command. "I made some inquiries about Captain Cowery's service history. Interesting thing about those inquiries, half of them came back with classifications above my clearance level." Alina studied the document. Sections had been redacted with black ink, but enough remained to suggest that Viper's previous assignments had involved intelligence operations, special access programs, or other activities that required extensive background clearances. "Why would a pilot's service record be classified?" Alina asked. "That's exactly the question that's been keeping me awake," Webb replied. "Because in my experience, pilots only get that level of classification when they've been involved in operations that officially never happened." Before Alina could respond, her pager buzzed with an urgent message. "Sir, we've got another mission request for Captain Cowery. High priority close air support, coordinates classified until airborne." Webb's expression darkened. 2 combat missions on her first day. That's not coincidence, Major. Someone specifically requested her for this assignment. As Alina left to brief Viper for her second mission, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all participants in a larger operation that none of them fully understood. Captain Tom Hawk Williams had been flying combat missions over Afghanistan for 2 years, but he had never been assigned as wingman to a pilot on their first day in theater. The order had come directly from Colonel Webb with unusual specificity. Maintain visual contact with Viper 1 at all times, observe and report mission execution, and under no circumstances engage targets without explicit clearance from flight lead. The instructions felt less like standard operating procedure and more like surveillance. "Viper 1, Hawk 2, he transmitted as they approached the mission area. "I have you visual, bearing 280, altitude Angels 15. "Copy Hawk 2. Maintain current position and altitude. This may get complicated." Williams checked his instruments. They were flying over terrain that had been contested for months, a valley system where enemy forces moved supplies and personnel through caves and hidden positions. Intelligence reports suggested anti-aircraft capabilities in the area, but nothing had been confirmed. "Viper 1, Hawk 2. I'm picking up electronic emissions consistent with search radar, possible AAA sites in your engagement zone." "Copy Hawk 2, I see them." Williams looked through his canopy toward Viper's aircraft. She had begun a shallow descent toward the target area, but her approach vector seemed unusual. Instead of following standard attack profiles that minimized radar exposure, she was flying directly toward the strongest electronic emissions. "Viper 1, advise you alter course to avoid radar coverage." "Negative Hawk 2, current approach is intentional." Williams felt his pulse increase. Either Viper was making a dangerous tactical error, or she knew something about the target area that wasn't in their mission brief. He watched as her A-10 continued its descent, now well within range of any surface-to-air systems. Hammer Base, Hawk 2, he transmitted to ground control. Request confirmation of threat assessment for current target area. Hawk 2 Hammer Base, threat level remains as briefed, no confirmed SAM sites. But Williams could see muzzle flashes erupting from positions throughout the valley as Viper's aircraft drew fire from multiple locations. Tracers arced toward her plane like deadly fireworks, and the electronic warfare systems in his cockpit lit up with threat warnings. Viper 1, you're taking heavy fire. Recommend immediate evasive action. Copy Hawk 2, beginning attack run. Williams watched in disbelief as Viper rolled into a textbook strafing attack, her GAU-8 cannon sending streams of depleted uranium rounds into precise target locations. But what amazed him wasn't her marksmanship. It was her flight path. She was maneuvering between threat positions with spatial awareness that suggested intimate familiarity with the terrain. How does she know where all the gun positions are located? Williams muttered to himself. Over the radio came Viper's voice, calm and professional. Hawk 2, Viper 1, target neutralized, RTB. As they flew back toward Kandahar, Williams realized he had witnessed something extraordinary. Captain Cowery hadn't just completed a successful combat mission. She had demonstrated tactical knowledge of enemy positions that went far beyond what any intelligence brief could provide. The question was how a supposedly new pilot had acquired such detailed knowledge of a contested valley in Afghanistan. Sergeant First Class Maria Doc Santos had been treating combat stress reactions at Kandahar for 18 months, and she had developed an instinct for recognizing pilots who carried psychological weight beyond normal deployment stress. Captain Cowery displayed some of the classic indicators: hypervigilance, emotional suppression, reluctant interaction with peers, but something about her presentation didn't fit standard patterns. "Captain," Doc said, as Viper completed her mandatory post-mission medical check, "how are you feeling after today's flights?" "Normal," Viper replied, but her physiological responses suggested otherwise. Heart rate slightly elevated, muscle tension in shoulders and jaw, eyes that constantly tracked movement around the medical facility. 2 combat missions on your first day can be overwhelming, even for experienced pilots. I've had busier days. Doc paused. That wasn't how newly deployed pilots typically responded to their first combat engagements. Most experienced adrenaline crashes, emotional processing, or at minimum heightened awareness of mortality. Viper's reaction suggested familiarity with combat stress that came from extensive prior experience. "Captain, have you previously deployed to combat zones?" "This is my first assignment to Kandahar." Doc noticed the precise wording. First assignment to Kandahar didn't necessarily mean first combat deployment. She had heard similar linguistic precision from pilots who had participated in classified operations that couldn't be discussed even in medical settings. "Any issues with sleep, appetite, or concentration since arriving?" "No." "Nightmares or intrusive thoughts?" For the first time, Viper hesitated before answering. "Nothing unusual." Doc made notes on her tablet. "Nothing unusual" suggested that nightmares and intrusive thoughts were part of Viper's normal experience, not healthy indicators for someone supposedly new to combat aviation. "Captain, I'm going to recommend standard follow-up in 2 weeks, but if you experience any symptoms that interfere with flight duties, I want you to contact me immediately." "Understood." As Viper left the medical facility, Doc reviewed her notes with growing concern. The pilot's psychological profile suggested extensive combat trauma that had been processed and compartmentalized with professional-level expertise. That kind of mental conditioning usually came from prolonged exposure to high-stress operations, specialized training programs, or both. Doc had treated pilots from various special operations units, and their psychological signatures shared certain characteristics with what she observed in Captain Cowrie. But special operations pilots were typically older, more senior, and carried service records that reflected their elite training. Viper's official personnel file showed none of those indicators, which meant either the file was incomplete or Captain Cowrie had acquired her combat experience through channels that bypassed normal military documentation. Either way, Doc planned to monitor the situation carefully. Pilots carrying unprocessed trauma were dangerous to themselves and their wingmen, regardless of how effectively they compartmentalized their psychological stress. In her experience, secrets had a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Phoenix Anderson had been reviewing intelligence reports in the Joint Operations Center when an encrypted message arrived that changed her understanding of the morning's events. As Kandahar's senior intelligence officer, she was accustomed to classified information that painted fuller pictures than what appeared in standard briefings. But this message carried classification levels that required her to clear her office and activate additional security protocols. The communication originated from a Department of Defense Special Access program that Phoenix recognized by designation, but had never been briefed on. The subject line was simple: Personnel Security, Notice Operation Blackwater Personnel. Inside the message was a photograph of Captain Zara Cowrie, along with service details that bore no resemblance to her official Air Force personnel file. According to this document, Viper had spent 3 years flying combat missions for a joint CIA military operation that provided close air support to intelligence operatives throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. Her actual combat experience included over 400 sorties in contested airspace, with confirmed kills against enemy aircraft, surface-to-air missile sites, and high-value ground targets. She had been shot down twice, captured once, and had spent 6 months in enemy custody before being recovered through a classified prisoner exchange. The prisoner of war medal that Colonel Webb had noticed wasn't just decoration. It represented survival under conditions that had broken other operatives. Phoenix read through after-action reports that detailed missions flown from bases that didn't officially exist, supporting operations that were never acknowledged, against enemies whose defeats were attributed to other causes. Viper had been one of 12 pilots assigned to provide aviation support for what the intelligence community called deniable operations. Of the 12 original pilots, only 3 had survived their assignments. Captain Cowrie was the only one still flying combat missions. The message concluded with operational guidance that explained her current posting to Kandahar. Intelligence sources had identified a high-value target in the region, someone whose capture or elimination required pilot skills that went beyond normal military training. Viper's assignment wasn't coincidental. It was part of an operation that was already in motion. Phoenix secured the message and sat back in her chair, trying to process the implications. Captain Cowrie wasn't just a pilot with unusual qualifications. She was an intelligence asset being positioned for a mission that hadn't been briefed to local command. Which meant Colonel Webb, Major Vasquez, and everyone else interacting with Viper were unwitting participants in an operation they didn't know existed. Phoenix reached for her secure phone to contact her superiors, then hesitated. The message had included a specific instruction: local command is not briefed on this operation. Maintain operational security until further notice. She was being asked to withhold classified information from her own chain of command, while observing an intelligence operation that was using Kandahar Airfield as cover for activities she couldn't discuss. In the intelligence world, that kind of compartmentalization usually meant someone was about to attempt something that could have significant political consequences. Master Sergeant Tony Chief Kowalski had been managing aircraft maintenance at forward operating bases for 15 years, and he had learned to spot pilots who carried more than standard military experience. Captain Cowery definitely fit that category, but her behavior patterns suggested something beyond typical special operations background. She arrived at the flight line each morning before dawn, conducting aircraft inspections with systematic thoroughness that reminded Chief of pilots who had learned that mechanical failures in hostile territory often meant death rather than inconvenience. Her attention to detail exceeded Air Force standards, and she performed checks on systems that weren't part of normal pre-flight procedures. More telling was her reaction to equipment failures. When a hydraulic gauge showed anomalous readings during her third day at Kandahar, most pilots would have reported the discrepancy and waited for maintenance clearance. Viper had diagnosed the problem, identified the specific component requiring replacement, and provided technical specifications that helped Chief's team complete repairs in half the normal time. "Ma'am," Chief had asked after the repair, "where did you learn hydraulic system troubleshooting?" "Various assignments," she had replied, but her knowledge suggested hands-on experience with aircraft maintenance under field conditions. Chief had encountered similar expertise among pilots who had operated from austere locations, where maintenance support was minimal and aircraft reliability was survival critical. But those assignments were typically documented in service records and reflected in pilot qualifications. Captain Cowery's official file showed no maintenance training, no assignments to remote locations, and no specialized qualifications beyond standard A-10 certification. That afternoon, Chief received an unusual request from Captain Cowery. She wanted to inspect the aircraft's electronic warfare systems and communication equipment, components that were maintained by specialized technicians rather than pilots. When Chief asked about the purpose of the inspection, she had provided technical justifications that demonstrated expert-level familiarity with the systems. "Ma'am, those systems are classified. I'll need to see your clearance documentation before allowing access." Viper had handed him a security card that Chief had never seen before. The classification level was above his clearance, which meant he couldn't verify its authenticity through normal channels. But the card appeared genuine, and declining access could create problems if Captain Cowery was operating under classified orders. As Chief watched her work, he noticed that she knew exactly which panels to remove and which components to inspect. Her movements suggested muscle memory, developed through extensive hands-on experience with the systems. When she finished, the electronic warfare suite was functioning with efficiency levels that exceeded manufacturer specifications. "How did you accomplish that?" Chief asked. "Software optimization," Viper replied. "Nothing that affects airworthiness." But Chief knew enough about the systems to recognize that the improvements required programming skills that went far beyond pilot training. Someone had taught Captain Cowery electronic warfare techniques that were typically restricted to intelligence specialists and contractor personnel, which raised questions about where she had acquired those skills and why they weren't reflected in her official qualifications. Captain Rick Longshot Chen was monitoring the evening air traffic when he received an encrypted communication that made him question everything he thought he knew about routine flight operations at Kandahar. The message was brief but specific. "Monitor all communications involving Viper call sign. Report unusual activity through classified channels only." The instruction came from an intelligence office that Chen recognized but had never been contacted by before. It suggested that Captain Cowery's flying activities were being monitored by agencies beyond normal Air Force command structure. That night, Chen reviewed audio recordings of Viper's radio communications from her first 3 days of operations. What he discovered confirmed his earlier suspicions about her background. Her voice patterns, terminology choices, and situational awareness indicated training that went beyond standard military aviation schools. More revealing were subtle variations in her communication style that suggested multilingual proficiency. During moments of high stress, Captain Cowery's pronunciation shifted slightly, revealing linguistic influences that weren't part of typical American English patterns. Chen had heard similar variations from pilots who had operated in regions where local language skills were operational necessities. Additionally, her radio discipline was exceptional even by special operations standards. She used minimum transmission times, avoided unnecessary communications, and employed brevity codes that weren't part of standard Air Force procedures. Chen recognized some of the terminology from joint operations with intelligence agencies, but others were unfamiliar. Most intriguing were her interactions with ground control personnel at other facilities. During coordination calls with controllers at Bagram and Kabul, Chen noticed that certain personnel seemed to recognize her call sign and provided information that wasn't typically available to transiting aircraft. Viper 1, this is Bagram Tower. Be advised, your usual frequency is active tonight. Copy Bagram, will monitor as required. Chen had no idea what usual frequency meant, but the exchange suggested prior relationships that predated her official arrival at Kandahar. As the evening progressed, Chen compiled his observations into a classified report that would be transmitted through intelligence channels rather than normal Air Force communications. But before sending the report, he reviewed recordings one more time, looking for additional details that might be relevant. During that final review, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. In the background of one transmission, barely audible beneath static and engine noise, he could hear what sounded like ground-to-air communications in a language that wasn't English, Dari, or Pashto. The transmission had been brief, but Chen was certain he had heard Arabic phrases that suggested coordination between Viper's aircraft and ground personnel who weren't part of official coalition forces. Which meant Captain Cowery might be receiving tactical support from sources that operated outside normal military command structures. Major Elena Ghost Vasquez was reviewing intelligence summaries when her secure phone rang with a call that would fundamentally alter her understanding of Captain Cowery's presence at Kandahar. The voice on the other end identified himself as Colonel James Mitchell from a Pentagon office she had never heard of. Major Vasquez, Mitchell said without preamble, I understand you've been observing Captain Cowery's integration into your operations. Yes, sir. She's performed exceptionally well on her initial missions. I'm sure she has. Major, I need to brief you on classified information that will help you understand Captain Cowery's actual background and mission parameters. Elena felt the conversation entering territory that would require careful handling. Sir, should I be receiving this briefing from my chain of command? Under normal circumstances, yes. But Captain Cowery's assignment involves special access programs that operate outside standard command structures. Your cooperation is essential for mission success. Mitchell proceeded to brief Elena on Operation Blackwater, a joint CIA military program that had used military pilots to provide aviation support for intelligence operations throughout the Middle East. Captain Cowery had been one of the program's most successful operatives, with a mission record that included operations in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Afghanistan. Her official service record has been modified to protect operational security, Mitchell explained. But her actual combat experience includes over 400 sorties in contested airspace, multiple aircraft losses, and survival training that few military personnel ever receive. Elena absorbed the information with growing astonishment. Sir, why is she at Kandahar now? Because intelligence sources have identified a high-value target in your operational area. Someone whose capture requires pilot skills that go beyond normal military training. Mitchell provided additional details that painted a picture of an operation already in motion. Captain Cowery's routine combat missions were actually reconnaissance flights, gathering intelligence and positioning assets for a larger action that would occur when conditions were optimal. Major, your role is to ensure that Captain Cowery has the operational support she needs, while maintaining cover for activities that cannot be officially acknowledged. Sir, this puts me in a difficult position with my chain of command. Your chain of command will be briefed on a need-to-know basis. Until then, you're operating under special compartmented information protocols that supersede normal reporting requirements. After the call ended, Alina sat in her office trying to process the implications. Captain Cowery wasn't just an unusually qualified pilot. She was an intelligence operative using Kandahar as a base for classified operations that could have strategic significance, which meant everyone at the base, from Colonel Webb to the maintenance crews, were unknowingly supporting an intelligence mission that none of them had been briefed on. Alina realized she was now part of a compartmentalized operation, where the success of the mission might depend on maintaining deception, even among their own personnel. In the intelligence world, that level of operational security usually indicated missions with significant political risk and potential for strategic consequences that could affect international relationships.